Look, I mean, I 100% agree with that. I mean, look, like this notion of Black Palestinian solidarity, it's a deep relationship. It goes back to the 1960s, right? It goes back to people like Malcolm and Angela and the Black Power movement and Kwame Ture and, you know, like all these guys, right? There's so many to name. And Black activists understood very clearly, you know, early on that the struggle that they were fighting in America was connected to the struggle that Palestinian brothers and sisters were fighting in Palestine to liberate themselves. And I mean, we can look at this from all sorts of different angles. I mean, today you can just take a look at the fact that, you know, the tear gas canisters that Israel uses on Palestinians are American made. The fact that you have these dozens and dozens and dozens of, you know, training programs between U.S. police and the Israeli army, where the U.S. police will literally go to Israel to learn techniques from the Israeli army. It's 100% real, you know, and, you know, never mind the fact that the U.S. is the largest funder of Israel, right? We give Israel more money than we give anyone else. So the U.S. is directly funding this system of oppression in Palestine. And never mind the fact that Palestinians themselves are a racialized people. Like, you know, I know my skin looks white, but an Israeli won't treat me like I'm white. You see what I mean? Like when I went to Palestine for the first and only time, I was subjected to humiliation, degradation. You know what I mean? Like, let me tell you the difference. How they tell it's your ID card. It's like some Nazi Germany shit. Like Palestinians have different color ID cards. They have different color license plates. Palestinians have, you know, different roads that they can use. They can't use the same roads as the settlers. You know what I mean? Like you don't have to go read a book about Jim Crow. Jim Crow is happening right now in Palestine. Even me, right? I have an American passport. When I show up to Tel Aviv airport, I'm not treated like an American because they already know who I am. Why? Because Israel knows that you're coming back to the land where your grandparents were born, that you were expelled from, and they don't want you there. They don't want you to feel like you have a connection to Palestine. They want you to, khalas, you've been pushed out, and now you're no longer a problem for them. And when you do come back and you start to create those connections, you become a problem for them because what you are doing is you are rejecting what Israel has always tried to do, which was separate Palestinians physically and ideologically. And especially with the Palestinians in exile, they have done everything possible to make it impossible for us to even come back to visit, right? Like there's a reason why I was strip searched on the way out from Tel Aviv airport. Like it's not because, you know what I mean? Like I'm an American. It's not because of any other reason except for the fact that my origin is Palestinian. There's a reason why when I arrived in Tel Aviv airport, the first thing they did was tell me I had to go to the office and speak with Israeli intelligence. And they held me for hours and they asked me to draw a family tree and they showed me pictures of Palestinians. And then they asked me who those people were. And then eventually a few hours later, they got to a photo of my grandfather from 1955 before he was made a refugee. And then I said, that's my grandfather. And then he said, I know.
He found the photo?
Yeah, because they have all our pixtures, dude. They have all our pictures. They seized all of our administrative like documents and files. Like when they took over and they expelled us. There was a lot of like we had a full civilization going. Like we had like a city hall. We had all these things. Yeah.
Stop you. Because it's time to go. It's time to get rolling.
Are we not on the podcast yet?
Yeah, we are. We're on now? We're on now? Okay.
We are now. All that was extra bonus footage, but now we're about to get to the meat and potatoes.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
I wasn't sure. He's getting juice. I'm like, yo, what's going on? But this has been an amazing conversation thus far already. And so, beautiful ladies and gentlemen, my young and Muslim people all around the world. Today we have a very special guest for a very, very important and very special occasion. We have Sister Lara Elborno. Yes, Lara Elborno here with us today to join us, to give us a much needed conversation because we've all seen what's been going on around the world as everyone stands in solidarity with Palestine. And this is not how we usually start the podcast, but you know what? This is a day for very unusual things.
Exactly.
So...
And for all the listeners, especially the new listeners, what to expect on this episode is to hear from Sister Lara the history about Palestine, what happened to the people, the ethnic cleansing, what's going on social media, what's going on Sheikh Jarrah. So make sure you tune in all the way to the end because you will be well informed, and then you can go and have those conversations with your family, your colleagues, your sports team members. Everybody needs to know what's going on because this is the discussion of the world. So let's go ahead and get this thing started, baby.
All right, Mo, give me the countdown, my friend.
3, 2, 1.
What's going on, everybody? This is Jabril Salam.
And Muhammad Hassan.
And you are listening to the Young and Muslim Podcast.
Aslaamu Alakum, everybody. So now that we give a proper introduction to Sister Lara, welcome. Aslaamu Alaikum.
Alaikum assalam. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. I found you on a random IG live call, and I knew at that very moment, I said, she's the one.
She's the one.
Thank you.
No, thank you for all the work that you do. We've had a very in-depth discussion before. A lot of people probably are able to listen. But very briefly, can you give people a description of who you are and what you do and where you're currently, like your background?
Yeah, for sure. So I am an international lawyer. I'm currently based in Paris, France. I am originally from Chicago, where I spent basically my whole life until 9 years ago when I moved to Paris. And I was born originally in Kuwait, the daughter of Palestinian refugees. I was also a Palestinian refugee myself when my family was expelled from Kuwait in 1991 during the time of the Gulf War, when many Palestinians were being forced to leave Kuwait. And so that's how we ended up in the United States. So while at the level of my grandparents' generation, we were prevented from returning to Palestine by the Zionists, at my generation, we were basically put in the position where we had to find a new home. And that's how we ended up in the United States.
That's nuts that you're getting tossed from one place to another, to another, to another. And then you end up in the U.S., which is pretty ironic considering why you had to leave your homeland in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the notion that I was expelled because of the establishment of a settler colony on my homeland that excluded me from that state, and then finding myself in the biggest settler colony in the world, you know, living on stolen land, there's definitely a lot of guilt that I experienced that was associated with that, right? But I mean, I had no other alternative, right? I couldn't go back to Palestine. All we wanted to do was go back to Palestine, but the Zionists wouldn't let us go back. And so this is the absurd reality that Palestinians find themselves in, which is that not only are we refugees, right? Because a lot of people are made refugees. They can go find, you know, new homes. And eventually, if the situation in the homeland improves, they may decide to go back. But Palestinians are at once refugees, and they are also stateless refugees, even though they came from a place, right? We all know the names of our towns and villages and cities that we were from and lived in before 1948, but we can't go back to them because the state that was set up on our land since 1948 expressly, by definition, excludes us from it. And not only that, but committed a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing starting in 1948. Starting a little bit before that, I mean, if I really want to get precise, but let's say in 1948, because that was the point in time which the huge expulsion of Palestinian refugees took place, where Zionist forces essentially expelled 80% of the Palestinian population and seized 78% of our land, you know.
So what kickstarted that? What kickstarted that initial expulsion? Because from what I do know of the history, Zionists started somewhere around the 1920s, 1910 era. Between then, them coming into, you know, Palestine and 1948, what was the state of the land at that point in time? What was that relationship like? And then how did it like escalate so far in 1948?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. It's really important. So what we see in Palestine is that there has always been a native population on the land of Palestine that has been there for millennia. Like, I don't even want to say centuries because it's not even accurate. Millennia. If you look back at the earliest recorded instance of the word Palestine, it's in Herodotus's history. It goes back 4,000 years ago. So if you're interested in that, you can check out Noor Masalha's book on Palestine that describes in great detail the very rich history of the Palestinian civilization. So Palestinians have been on this land and are the descendants of all the people who have inhabited the land of Palestine for millennia. So you guys know very well that, like, Palestine, there were many different groups and civilizations that had passed through and ruled Palestine at one point or another. You had the Greeks and the Romans and the Byzantines and the Mamluks and the Ottomans and the Persians. There were numerous civilizations that at one point had control over Palestine. But what always remained was that there was always people as well, right? These people didn't have control over nothing, right? So there was always like a native population that was there. And who are the Palestinian people? But they are the descendants of all of those civilizations that at one point were in Palestine, going back thousands of years, right? Quick anecdote. I took a 23andMe test to find out more about my origins. The test told me that I was 80% Arab near Beirut. So obviously Palestinian is not one of the choices. So that's about as close as I could get. Obviously I'm not from Beirut. My grandmother and my great-grandmother and my great-great-grandmother, going all the way back up are all from Palestine. So, whether it be Gaza or Jaffa, my family has had a continuous presence in Palestine for, centuries. But what's interesting is that I also saw that I had 12 to 15% Greek in my background. That's not because any of my family members are from Greece, but that's because the Greeks were in Palestine.
For a while.
Yes. So the idea is that this is who we are. Like the notion that Palestinians are, they're just Arabs, they can just go to Jordan. Like that's completely ahistorical. These are the people that have been on this land for millennia, and they are the descendants of all the people who came through this land. That's who Palestinians are. So this is what Palestine looks like. Even, let's say as early as, let's say by the early 1900s, like we have a very heavy presence in Palestine. We are a civilization. We're building cities. We're building towns. We have infrastructure. We're farming the land. We have a huge farming tradition in our culture, right? And at this time, Palestine was under the Ottoman Empire, right? The Ottoman Empire, which was in its decline, it's in its final stages. By 1917, the Ottoman Empire falls completely, and who shows up in Palestine but the British? So you guys remember this. This is when the Brits and the French come in and they start drawing up their little maps with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, splitting up the Middle East into completely random, countries with borders that had never existed before and that were entirely arbitrary. And, Britain took Palestine and Jordan. France took, what is now Syria and Lebanon, and they started to colonize this land. So this obviously creates a huge shock to Palestinian society because for the last, 400 some years, they had been under the administration of the Ottomans. And all of a sudden, for the first time ever, now they are under this foreign European, British colonial rule.
So quick question.
Yeah.
So before they started drawing lines, right? Kind of like with the states in the U.S., was Palestine considered its own state, or was it more like a territory that was ran by the Ottomans?
Well, it depends on what you mean by state, because the notion of a nation state is a rather recent notion, right? So during the time of the Ottomans, there were no nation states. It was just territory that was, under the administration of the Ottomans. You start to have national movements that are, starting to grow as a response to colonialism, right? People are starting to reject foreign control and domination, and they're starting to say, no, we're our own people, and we're going to rise up and fight for our rights. And that is how you end up having nation states, that end up gaining their freedom from foreign colonial rule. The difference is that Palestine was never offered that option. Instead of Palestine going through, the same sort of history that Lebanon went through, that Syria went through, they became their own states, Palestine was passed from one colonial rule to another. So we went from the British to the Zionists.
I like how you also talked about going back 4,000 years, because a lot of our listeners are Muslim, right? So this supersedes religion. And when we have that conversation with Palestine and Israel and what's going on there, we're like, that is where Al-Aqsa Mosque is. That's where the second Qibla, the first Qibla was. That's where our Prophet had Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had his spiritual journey, right? So a lot of the conversation is revolved around that, which is nice.
Yes.
but then you forget about the history of the people. Islam's only, 1,400 and some change? You went back all the way 4,000 years.
Yes.
And I remember when I had a conversation with one of my Catholic friends, we were going back and forth saying, who was there? No, the Muslims were there first. No, the Christians were there first. You're like, no, the Palestinian people. Palestinian people were there first. But it's crazy how even us as Muslims, not knowingly, erased that history too. So I'm glad that you talked about that, because I think that's very, very important.
Yeah, that's super essential. I mean, Palestinians predate Islam in the land of Palestine, right? We were there before, the Arab, invasion, the 7th century, right? And so, we were all different religions. I mean, we also, our religions, evolved with the time, right? Depending on who was in Palestine. Palestinians, converted over time, became Muslim, became Christian, then became Muslim, right? So absolutely, the Palestinians were here first.
So now we're to this point where you have the Zionists. They've come in. They started basically settling in. The UN at this point, after World War II, grants them a lot of land there because of the Holocaust, and there's a lot of sympathy for the Jews that want to return to this place, Israel. But now we get to 1948, and this is where we've alluded to and we've kind of built up towards. What exactly happened in and around this time, and why is it so significant?
Okay, so let me go back just a little bit before 1948 and just give a little bit of context to the Zionist movement, because I think it's really critical for the listeners to understand that when I'm talking about Zionism, I'm not talking about Judaism. I'm not talking about Jewish people. I am speaking about a political ideology that was born in Europe in 1897, that was spearheaded by a guy named Theodor Herzl, who himself was an atheist. He was a secular guy, but he had come from a Jewish background. And he starts to, write about this idea of finding the Jews a place to go. And initially, the idea was very radical, right? A lot of Jewish people didn't get on board. They were very comfortable where they were already, and they didn't see any reason why they had to go anywhere else. Herzl starts to entertain the idea that, well, maybe we could go to Uganda, let's go to Azerbaijan, maybe we'll go to Madagascar. It wasn't very clear where he was going to go and set up his state. But eventually, he settles on Palestine. And the reason for that is because Herzl and all the other early Zionist leaders, and you can go through all of their works, their writings, their journal entries, we have a lot of information that's available to us. They were actually inspired by European settlers in America. And they were inspired in particular by the notion that they could infuse in their settler colonial movement a religious discourse, that they could sort of cloak it in a religious discourse, and that in doing so, they would be able to be more convincing because they had seen the success of a Christian sort of inspired settler colonial framework in the United States. And I mean, if you just look very clearly at what we learned when we were growing up, Manifest Destiny, right? It's the idea that God said we should be in all the land from the sea to the sea. Like that's what Manifest Destiny is. So Zionism is very similar to that. It's the notion that, well, the Jews should go to Palestine and settle the land of Palestine. And if you look at the writings of these early Zionist leaders, they all refer to themselves as colonists. Like they refer to themselves as constituting a settler colonial movement. They refer to this movement as being a secular movement. And they referred to the Palestinians as the natives who essentially needed to be expelled from the land of Palestine. These are their words, not mine.
I'm literally getting chills right now because this is literally U.S. history repeating itself.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. It's nuts.
Absolutely. So if you look, for example, like in 1937, you have Ben Gurion who says, with compulsory transfer, we would have a vast area for settlement. I support compulsory transfer. I don't see anything immoral in it. And so this is also a key point because people will often say today, the Zionists will try to paint this, sort of illusion, or they'll try to rewrite history and they'll say, there's no such thing as the Palestinians. They're just Jordanians. They can go to Saudi Arabia, all sorts of things. It's absolutely absurd because your early Zionist leaders knew very well that they were Palestinians because they physically debated what to do with us. They talked about it. It was a conundrum. It was something that was like, okay, well, maybe we can just convince them to leave. Maybe we can pay them. The nicer ones were like, okay, we'll just pay them for their properties and then they'll leave and then we'll just take it. The less nice ones were like, let's roll up with guns and bombs and rape the women and kill the men and scare them and then cause entire communities to flee. And we'll print pamphlets telling people what we did to the city next door, and we'll spread those pamphlets out, and we'll create this intense fear in these communities that will drive them to be expelled if we don't kill or injure them first. Right. So this is like the type of discussions that the Zionists were having.
So this might be a very basic, low-level question, but I think I should ask it. So where were the Jews originally before they went to Palestine? Where were the pockets of Jewish people at that time?
Before they went to Palestine, they were all over the world. They were all over the world. I mean, you had people in Europe, you had people in the United States, you had people in Africa, you had people coming from all over the world, right? That's why you see like there's, Eastern European Jews, there's American Jews, there's Ethiopian Jews. They're coming from all over. There's Jews coming from the Arab world as well, like Yemen, Iraq. And, many of the people from these communities eventually joined the Zionist movement for various reasons, right? It wasn't always ideologically driven by the need to settle the land because God said so. Some people did so because it just economically made sense. So I'll leave it at that. But what was your question before that? I thought it was important to give the context of Zionism, but
what was leading? You were leading up to 1948.
Yes, leading up to 1948. So basically, I think it's super important to understand that in 1945, by 1945, Zionism had managed to attract around 500,000 settlers to a country whose population was 2 million. So they were there by 1945. They had showed up. The problem was they were essentially like a state within a state because they had managed to buy up only 7% of the land of Palestine up until that point. Right? So the Palestinians, by 1945, they still own 93% of the land of Palestine.
How did they buy the land? Was there like a peace treaty? Like, how did they buy the land? Like, how did that deal actually happen? Did they speak to the Palestinian government? Did they just come with like, hey, here's some money?
No, it was individual landowners. So like for the early, the early settlement that allowed these, Jewish people to come and buy some of the land. It was individual transactions with Palestinian landowners, but there was no problem yet, right? Because at this point, there was not yet this clear indication that the Zionist movement was intending to replace us and was going to be able to do it, right? We had always been, up until this point, struggling, right? Whether it be against the British colonial regime or even, the Zionists. There were, uprisings in the 1930s. Palestinians have always been resisting colonialism. But the difference is that there comes this turning point where the Zionist movement all of a sudden gets this, support, this external support from Europe. And that external support includes things like weapons and money, right? And that then, gives them the power to be able to carry out this massive campaign of ethnic cleansing in 1948. So just to reiterate, by 1945, they had 7% of the land. What happens in 1948? They carry out a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing that is known as the Nakba. And in Arabic, the Nakba refers to the catastrophe. Palestinians refer to this as a catastrophe because it is the moment in time when the majority of the Palestinian population is expelled from Palestine and made stateless refugees. They end up in refugee camps all over the Arab world. They end up as internal refugees, like in places like the West Bank and Gaza. They get pushed down into Gaza, and the Zionists are not able to take Gaza. So what you end up having is the birth of the Israeli state on 78% of the land of historic Palestine. When I speak about historic Palestine, just to be very clear for the listeners, I am speaking about the land that is like on my necklace right now. I don't think you can see it, but it basically today is what we call Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, because all of that was Palestine, right? So 1948, they expel 80% of us, over 750,000 Palestinians. The numbers go up to 1 million or more, depending on which scholar you're citing. And they are able to take 78% of our land, and they don't compensate us for it. It is a very violent campaign of ethnic cleansing. And the Palestinians are essentially overnight turned into refugees. They they lose their houses. Their villages and cities are destroyed. Over 520 Palestinian cities and towns were entirely destroyed by the Zionists. And interestingly enough, in the decades that followed, the Jewish National Fund sponsored programs to plant a tree in Israel, in order to essentially change the physical landscape. They were saying that they were doing this for eco reasons, but the reality was they were doing this to cover up the vestiges of the prior Palestinian civilization that had existed. And they brag on their website about how they have planted hundreds of millions of trees in Israel. And I have seen it with my own eyes. I stood, in 48, and I looked at this tower that was covered by trees in 2010, the first and only time I went to Palestine. And I looked at a photo of it pre-1948 that I had, presented to me by my guide. And that tower was covered with houses that just simply don't exist anymore. And so that is just one example. I mean, there are entire books, there's a book called Palestine Remembered that details every single city, who lived there, which families, what, their form of agriculture was, what their, economy was based on. I mean, it was an entire civilization that was lost. Our history stopped. It was interrupted in 1948.
Was really interesting is that if you know history, which apparently you definitely do, but for our listeners that know history, if you look back, like you said, if you look at the earliest, the settlers within not just America, but even South America, and you watch what they did to the Native Americans, they hit them with the switch and bait, right? Or the bait and switch. Hey, happy Thanksgiving.
One of the Trail of Tears? Was it something similar in America, the Trail of Tears?
No, the conquistadors down in South America with the Spanish. All of that is literally, everything you're saying is exactly the same sequence. And it's nuts because when you're in class, when you're in school, you look at these things as that happened then. It's not. The worst thing I hate hearing people say is 2021. This shouldn't be happening. But it's dude, it's been happening for the last 70, 80, 100 years. So it's we have to know what came beforehand to properly understand where what's going on now is leading, because it's really leading into something that we're actually living in right now. It's just, yeah, thank you for going through this, because you're just bringing it up.
Absolutely. I mean, look, there's a lot of historical points that we're not going to be able to cover. I'm not going to cover the Balfour Declaration and its significance, but because I basically, described to you what the impact of it was. I'm not going to cover the UN partition plan. The Zionists will always say, oh, well, the Arabs rejected the partition plan. Well, of course we did. You showed up in our house and then you demanded to have half of it. And then you were like, why did you reject it? Right. I'm not going to get into those details, but the point is that ever since 1948, nothing has been the same for Palestinians, because what happens is the majority of us end up in refugee camps in the Arab world where we don't become citizens, right? People like my family, I'm originally from Gaza. We didn't leave in 1948 because Gaza was not ethnically cleansed in 1948. But what ended up happening was many, many Palestinians came from the areas that were ethnically cleansed just above and came into Gaza. And today, 80% of the people in Gaza that are now feeling this brute colonial violence, under the F-16 bombs as we speak, literally, are not even from Gaza to begin with. 80% of them are actually from cities and villages that the Zionists destroyed in 1948 and expelled them from so that they could create a state that excluded them from it. And, I have family in Gaza right now that, lost part of their home because it was hit in a missile attack a few days ago. And, it's not lost on me, the irony that this family was made stateless refugees 73 years ago, almost to the day, because the Nakba, we celebrate it in May, right? We don't celebrate it, we commemorate it. Excuse me, you'll have to cut that.
No celebration, for sure.
So they were made stateless refugees by Israel again, 73 years later, right? And Palestinians in 2021 are now, the scenes that are coming out of Gaza, they essentially look like the Nakba of 1948. They're leaving their houses with their, with whatever belongings they can hold, and they're trying to look for someplace safe to go. But of course, in Gaza, there is no place safe to go because it's the most densely populated piece of land on earth, even more densely populated than Manhattan. And there is no place for them to go. There's no place they can run to. There's no safe zone. Israel won't let them actually escape. If they approach the border, they'll get shot. If they, try to go out by the sea, they'll get shot as well. It happens all the time to Palestinian fishermen. You can look it up. The reason for that is because for the last 15 years, part of the colonial framework that Israel uses to oppress Palestinians has been to impose a land and sea blockade on Gaza. So that means that nothing goes in, nothing comes out. Things like food and medicine and building materials are heavily restricted. Israel's official government policy is to put Palestinians in Gaza on a calorie-restricted diet. That's their governmental policy. Okay, they are starving Palestinians in Gaza intentionally. There's 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. 80% of them are refugees. Half of the population is children. You can take a look at some of the reporting that was done in 2006 by the Israeli journalist Amira Hass, which she was able to retrieve some of the official government lists of what are the items that Israel bans for entry into Gaza on the basis of security reasons, so-called. These things include, the list includes things like chocolates and tea and toothbrushes. I mean, things that, of course, have nothing to do with security reasons, but, whose deprivation, the only purpose of which is really just to punish a civilian population, right? So this has been the situation of life for people in Gaza for the last 15 years. And it's been very difficult because every few years, Israel will instigate a new round of violence, which will allow it to carry out a murderous assault on Gaza. We have seen it in 2006. We saw it again in 2009, 2010. We saw it again in 2014. And we're seeing it again today. And, if you just take the words of Netanyahu, who a few days ago said that this time we're going to use more force than we've ever used before, and that we promise it'll be unlike anything they've ever seen before. Well, that's a clear statement to commit genocide, because in the last military assaults on Gaza in 2014, Israel killed over 550 Palestinian children with absolutely no accountability for this crime, and over 2,000 people, the majority of whom were civilians. And of course, this was documented by Amnesty International, all the leading human rights organizations, the United Nations, and nothing happened. So we have a clear statement of genocide by the leader of Israel today. And his war minister also said a few days ago that they were going to, quote, flatten Gaza. So this is, unfortunately, people in Gaza are living up.
So who holds them accountable? Who's to hold them accountable?
Well, I mean, states are supposed to hold each other accountable, whether it be through the imposition of sanctions, whether it be through, using diplomatic efforts, pressure, things like that. I mean, citizens also can try to hold states accountable when they violate international law and violate human rights through efforts like boycott. And I can speak about that a little bit later. But, Palestinians have tried for decades to hold Israel accountable for violations of international law. We have tried everything. We have tried everything from nonviolent resistance, boycotts, marches, strikes. We held strikes in, the 1930s. We tried everything from approaching various international bodies, whether it be the UN, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, which rendered a decision for us in 2004, which held that the apartheid wall that Israel built was illegal. And in 2021, it still has not been dismantled. So we've tried everything. And unfortunately, none of our efforts have been successful in freeing us from this colonial violence and this apartheid state. And so 73 years later, after the beginning of this campaign of ethnic cleansing, we are continuing to fight for our freedom.
So right now, when the Israeli government is sending missiles over, who is protecting the Palestinian people? Where's the militia? Where's the military? Where's the government?
We don't have an army. We don't have a navy. We're a stateless people. I mean, this is the thing that I always say to people, because, people like to normalize state violence. Like, state violence, for some reason, is seen as legitimate just because they're wearing uniforms and because they have nuclear weapons and, fancy forms of, military aircraft. And people like to demonize, the armed resistance of a stateless people. And I think that is completely illegitimate. There's no reason for us to normalize state violence, especially when it is at this ampler and when it is so brutal. And, especially coming from an international legal perspective, right? Because I'm also an international lawyer. We hear all the time, oh, but Hamas. And the truth is that under international law, Palestinians have the right to use armed resistance against a colonial occupier that is carrying out a military occupation of their land. That is what international law says. But we never speak about that when we're addressing this issue in the public discourse, whether it be when the United States is, commenting on the latest flare-up of colonial violence, or when the mainstream media is addressing this issue. They don't care about international law. They don't even know international law, right? How many times do you see them interview an international lawyer to comment on the situation? We hear about things from journalists or pundits, but we don't actually hear, we rarely hear from scholars. But the fact of the matter is that we have this right under international law to resist using armed resistance. And on the other hand, there is absolutely no right for a colonial entity to exist and impose this form of domination and brutality on a colonized and occupied people. That right simply does not exist. There's no framework for it. There's also no right to practice apartheid. I mean, apartheid is a war crime. So this is what Israel's doing, but it's getting away with it under the guise of defending itself.
So can you quickly go into what apartheid is? A lot of people have heard of it because of what went on in South Africa. They know Nelson Mandela, but they don't actually know what apartheid is and how it's similar or different from what was going on in South Africa.
Yeah, so look, I mean, the connection between apartheid South Africa and what is happening in Palestine has been made by many scholars. And of course, they've debated some of the differences in the actual features of, the different regimes. And I don't think that that's going to be interesting for your listeners, so I'm not going to get into it. But the thing that people need to understand about apartheid is that it's essentially a form of systematic segregation. I mean, it's racialized discrimination that is on the books. And I can give you a very clear example of how Israel does this. In 2018, Israel passed the nation-state law. What does the nation-state law say? It says that Jewish people and only Jewish people have the right to self-determination in Israel. It establishes settlement as a national value, right? Which, by the way, settlement is also in violation of international law, violates the Fourth Geneva Conventions. But now it's a national value of Israel, and it downgrades Arabic to a second-tier status after having been an official language. So what Israel is doing, and I think this is what your listeners really need to understand, all countries suffer from some form of racial discrimination, whether it be amongst the people or embedded into the features of society. That's a fact, right? The difference with Israel is that, very few countries are actually defined by racial entitlement under the law, right? That's what makes Israel so different. That's what made South Africa so different, was that the system of racial segregation and discrimination and this tiered system of rights is how the country operates on the books. That's why it's apartheid, right? What I've just explained to you about Palestinians having, to use different roads and having different colored ID cards and having being restricted to live in certain areas, and their communities get smaller and smaller. That's why we refer to them as Bantustans. Whereas Jews, are allowed to expand into whatever territory they want, even if it's occupied land. There is absolutely no question about the fact that East Jerusalem, including the city of Sheikh Jarrah, are occupied militarily by Israel under international law, and Israel has no claim to that land. That means that land is Palestinian land, right?
That was my next question in regards to the West Bank, the East Bank, Jerusalem. Like, how can the IDF soldiers or the Zionists be, like, how can they be the ones in charge in regards to who goes into the mosque, who doesn't, But
that's exactly the point, right? Because look, I mean, if we think back to a few weeks ago, when the aggression really started, Palestinians were prevented from accessing Al-Aqsa Mosque during the last 10 days of Ramadan, right? And it came to a boiling point where the Israeli occupation forces entered Al-Aqsa Mosque. They fired stun grenades, sound bombs, they used rubber bullets. They ended up injuring many Palestinians who lost their eyes. People lost fingers. Women were praying, and the tear gas was everywhere. And my only question for you is, why are you in my mosque to begin with, right? Like, this is my mosque. East Jerusalem is it's uncontested that this is Palestinian land under international law. Why are you here to begin with? You shouldn't even be here in the first place. But, and if you look at exactly what Israel said in the aftermath of this, their propaganda tried to say, they posted pictures on Twitter. Look at the Palestinian terrorists. They put rocks in their mosque so that they could hurt the soldiers. And it's like, if you're close enough to be hit by my rock, you're too damn close. You know what I mean?
You're in my bubble.
Right.
Like, why are you in my space? But that's the whole premise of the state of Israel to begin with. The entire state was created in a brutal act of violence that didn't ever cease because the underlying issue was never addressed, which is that people were kicked out of their homes. They remain kicked out of their homes, and they continue to be kicked out of their homes. And that is why the story of Sheikh Jarrah is so essential to the Palestinian struggle, because Sheikh Jarrah represents the story of every single Palestinian city. Muhammad al-Kurd's family was not originally from Sheikh Jarrah. They were originally from a city which, in 1948, they were expelled from by the Zionists. And then that's how they ended up in Sheikh Jarrah.
Yeah, I think that's what he said in his interview with CNN. He said, this is my third home. Right, and we got kicked out of each one, and this might be our third one that we get kicked out of as well.
Absolutely. And what does this show? This shows very clearly what Israel's values are. Israel is not interested in any sort of a resolution with the people that it occupies. First of all, it has no incentive to, because when someone is in a position of power, they're not going to relinquish their power voluntarily. I mean, that just makes no sense.
That's white supremacy.
Sorry?
That's white supremacy.
Thank you. Absolutely. Right? But even more than that, Israel has never defined its borders. Israel continues to expand its borders, and it uses its settlers as a means to do that. They literally come onto our land, they steal our houses, they move in, and they continue to expand and expand and expand. And all of this is with the aim of eventually creating a greater Israel. And greater Israel goes beyond the borders of historic Palestine. It includes parts of Syria, and, they've already taken the Golan Heights, and they want to continue to expand. That's what their goal is as a settler colony, and they are fulfilling it. They are doing exactly what they said they would be doing. They are settling the land, and they are removing the natives, and they continue to do so in 2021. Now, I just want to be very clear that what's happening in Gaza is not separate from this, right? You can have different forms of ethnic cleansing. The ethnic cleansing that's happening in Sheikh Jarrah and in occupied East Jerusalem and in the West Bank, occupied West Bank, more generally, where Palestinians just are being kicked out of their homes, their land is being seized by, the state, and it's being turned into, settlements for Jews, is a form of legal ethnic cleansing, right? It takes place before the colonial court, where the rate of conviction or the rate of having a judgment rendered against you, if you're a Palestinian, is 99%. That's an actual statistic. You can look it up, right? So you stand no chance before the colonial court. Wow. Right? And so that's, sorry, just one more thing. Yeah. So that's like that legal form of ethnic cleansing. But what's happening in Gaza is the full brute force ethnic cleansing, where we literally just massacre you while you sleep. And we've seen numerous examples of that in the last few days. An entire family of 10 was massacred in their sleep with an F-16 missile. A doctor that works in Al-Shifa Hospital was massacred in his sleep. He was a doctor that worked with Doctors Without Borders literally yesterday. And he led the coronavirus response in Gaza. Israel knew very well what it was doing when it surgically attacked his home, right? They say that they're the most moral army in the world because their attacks are so precise. They precisely attacked a house of a doctor and his family and killed them all while they slept without any warning, right? And they did the same with another doctor on the same night, a neurologist that we know. And that's the thing, is like Israel gets away with saying that, oh, we're so moral, oh, it's all Hamas. It's like, no, it's not Hamas, because we actually know who you're murdering. Like, I actually know the Doctors Without Borders doctor through one person who used to work with him at a Shifa hospital, who's a friend of mine. So no, they're not Hamas, because we know who you're killing. We literally know them.
So here, like, I've been in the software high-tech sales here in America for about 10 years, and all of the major cybersecurity companies that we work with are from Israel, are in Tel Aviv. So it makes me think, like, wow, these, like you mentioned, these are no ordinary Joe Schmoes. These people are high-tech, very advanced. They have the money, they have the guns, they have the military. And I like how you mentioned in regards to the legal system, because I thought about it, like here in America, if somebody tried to take my home, I pull out my paperwork. I have my deed. No, this is my house.
Doesn't matter.
Check out the public records. But even Sheikh Jarrah, when the refugees, I believe it was the 28 families that were sent over there, they never even got the paperwork in the mail to say that these are their homes. They said, we're going to send it to you, but never did. So everybody's in on it. So it's just like, what do you do at that point?
Yeah, look, I mean, every Palestinian family that has been expelled not only has their land deed going back to the Ottoman era, right? But also has their key, because they literally left thinking they would go back in 2 weeks. I mean, there is this anecdote that we tell that, you know, they left the coffee on the stove because they thought they were coming back. And they haven't been back since. And this is the tragedy of what it means to be a Palestinian. Our entire cultural identity and our community, it was interrupted. It just died in 1948, and we became separated, and it led to this absurd reality where, like, someone like myself, who's a Palestinian refugee, growing up in the United States, I didn't even meet my grandparents till I was 16, because we were in the U.S. and we were waiting for the green card and, to be able to travel and get the passport. And my grandparents, still being over in Kuwait, they didn't have a passport because they were still stateless, and so they couldn't come over and travel and see us. And so what you have is this culture, which used to be very family oriented, everybody living next to each other. You know how Arabs are, right? And all of a sudden we end up on all corners of the world, separated, by borders, and we just never see each other.
Man, it's just wild, because the whole point of refuge is to be able to come back home later on. And what you just mentioned right now, people still have their keys for their old houses. That's just crazy to me. And it's very interesting to the fact that you mentioned that the Zionist movement is trying to go beyond Palestine. Like, they're in Syria, they're in different pockets. So if we do not speak up or say something, like, who knows how far out they're going to go. And I was asking somebody, I was just like, well, if this has been going on for so long, then why does everybody give them a pass? And as soon as you say anything about the Zionists, people start attacking you, just like they did Ilhan Omar, saying you are being anti-Semitic. Even if you give them the verbatim difference, they don't want to hear it. And I'm sure that's not a coincidence.
Well, to I guess kind of put your question in a nutshell, what is the difference between a Zionist, an Israeli, and then a Jew?
Excellent question. Judaism is a religion that has existed for over 2,000 years. It is a religion like Christianity, like Islam. God gives Jews certain laws that they must follow, and that is what makes them Jews. Their adherence to those laws or not, and those beliefs or not. It's the same thing like, what is a Muslim? A Muslim is somebody who believes in the message of Islam and also takes, physical steps to follow God's law, right? That's what Judaism is. Zionism is a political ideology that is about 100 years old, that was born out of a secular national movement and has nothing to do with Judaism. And the proof is in the fact that there are so many Jewish anti-Zionists. Okay, my co-host on my podcast is a fierce Jewish anti-Zionist American. We have already interviewed 2 Jewish anti-Zionists on our podcast, in the 10 episodes that we've had. One of them being an Israeli who grew up in a very Zionist household, but is now like a recovering Zionist. He saw the light and he realized that the state that he, loved for many years and was very dear to him was actually born out of ethnic cleansing and genocide. And so he distanced himself from that and now has become hugely outspoken for the liberation of Palestine. That's Miko Pellet. If people are interested, they can go listen to that episode in our podcast, the Palestine Pod. And an Israeli is somebody who goes to Israel and immediately gets Israeli nationality. Now, what are the conditions to get Israeli nationality? You just have to be Jewish. That's it. And it doesn't matter where you're from. And a perfect illustration of that is, I'm sure you guys saw the video of Settler Jacob, who's arguing with Mona Al-Kurd, being like, and she's like, Jacob, this is not your house. And he's like, well, if I don't take it, somebody else will. I'm sure you also noticed that Jacob had a very Brooklyn accent.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
He was a settler coming from America,
Well, I think it was back in college, I believe, or I think you and I may have talked about it, like, the people in Israel, they tell people to come back home and they give them incentives. And I always thought, I was curious as to why, but now that makes sense. Like, come, we'll give you a place to live. We'll even pay you, right?
Yes,
Every single
people.
month, but I understand it's all part of the plan. And my question is, do they know what they're doing at the time, or they're just like the Israelis? Are they like, hey, I'm just going home? Like, do they? Well, they know the history, then they should know what they're doing.
It's difficult to generalize, right? Like, there are Jewish people who show up in Israel because they believe that God gave them that land. They're ideologically driven. You can see videos of them talking with one another, and it's very scary. They are Jewish supremacists. They resemble very much white supremacists in the way that they speak. They speak about how the Palestinians should be their slaves or they should be expelled. They talk about how we should be raped. They talk about how, they use very violent genocidal language against us. There was also Jewish people that moved to Palestine because of these economic incentives. And, it's just a good deal for them. And they don't really care about, what it means morally, right? And those people, if they were given a choice and they were given money, a lot of them would leave. But Israel continues to incentivize people to go. That's why, like, if you look at the settlements on stolen Palestinian land, you'll see they've all got like swimming pools and they've got like, manicured lawns. And then like, meanwhile, like Palestinian village across the street is like all dusty because they take all our water. They literally take all our water and then they give us, just a tiny percentage of it back, and they charge us 4 times more than the Jewish settlement, which is illegal.
They're basically trying to make you guys leave out.
That's insane. Because you can't do that. Well, I don't know if you can do that here.
Look. Let's not start talking about Flint, right? What I found interesting when I was doing research on Zionism is that when they started that movement towards Zionism, it was with the intent of starting a ethnic of, how like now people will say, yo, I'm Jewish. Like you say I'm black, you're like, yo, I'm Jewish. That wasn't always the case. And and I thought that for so long. I was like, you can't be Jewish. You're a Jew, but Judaism is a religion, not an ethnic background. However, that's what the Zionists partially aimed for when they started the movement, was that we're going to make it so that we are an ethnic group, not a religious group. And I feel like that's been part of how they've been so successful in covering up this blanket white supremacist nature by saying that, no, it's our people, it's our heritage, but it's really something, as you said, it's been fabricated and created. It's as man-made as it gets.
I mean, I could go down the rabbit hole. Like, they had to create a language. They changed all their names. Like, Netanyahu's name is not Netanyahu, but they all changed their names to make them sound more Hebrew, right? Because they were coming from all over the world. Like, there was, and Miko Pella talks about this on the episode that we did with him. There was this move to, create a people that was not historically actually relevant or connected to the land, right? So they also, there's so many examples, but just think of the fact that, like, they take our food, they take our culture, they take our songs, they sing our songs and they say they're their songs. They say hummus is theirs, but it's not.
It sounds like Elvis.
It's an absurd notion. It's an absurd notion that, like, you guys, like, my grandmother is older than Israel. You guys showed up here in 1948. We were eating hummus for hundreds of years before 1948. So how are you guys going to show up here from Europe and say that hummus is Israeli? It just doesn't make sense. And the Israeli researchers themselves today, there are university researchers that have done this work. I've cited to their work on our podcast. I think it was episode 3, where we went down and we looked at the scholarly articles, and even they agree that, it turns out they actually took all the food from the natives who they were also expelling.
Well, the thing is like that you don't have to do a lot of research. I mean, it's not like Israel is 1,000 years old. They've been there for 50, 60, 70 years. Like, it's crazy that we try to call a spade a club, but a spade is always going to be a spade. No matter how you try and frame it, it's always going to be that. So why have we gotten to this point now, right, where the world is in a complete uproar for Palestine? Why did this not happen in 2014? Why is it happening now, where people are getting more educated and they're really saying, yo, Israel is tripping. Like, we're starting to pull back the blanket.
Yeah, look, I mean, I can't say exactly why now, right? But I suspect that part of it was a response to Black Lives Matter. The notion that a bunch of people around the world about a year ago became, incredibly sensitized to questions of racial injustice in a way that they never had before. Although they should have. They should have been paying attention the entire time, because Black people have been saying this the entire time. The same way that Palestinians have been saying it's apartheid, it's settler colonialism, it's ethnic cleansing the entire time. And nobody's been listening to us.
Look,
right?
We've been saying this since the 60s. So we've been on the same page for a long time. Yeah. You feel me? Yes. We've been on the same page, but I digress.
Yeah. So I honestly think that a lot of it arises out of this understanding that you cannot say both sides anymore about conflicts. You must pick a side. Right? So, it's the same thing with saying like all lives matter, right? I'm just trying to sort of quell the conflict. I don't want, all lives matter. It's all good. All lives matter. But no, that's actually not the case, because the way that all lives matter is used in response to a Black American talking about the daily injustice that they face and the reality of what it means to be a Black man or a Black woman in America. All lives matter is a way to silence very legitimate grievances that people are feeling and experiencing and they're hurting from, right? So it's like, no, all lives matter, everything's fine. Actually, no, everything's not fine, right? And I mean, you guys, I don't have to go into the statistics of why everything's not fine for Black people, right? That's, we all know that right now, by now, hopefully, if we've been paying attention, right? So I think that probably helped. People realize that you can't say both sides with Palestine and Israel anymore. And that's unfortunately the language that has been used by people who have been reluctant to take a side. They would say things like both sides. They would say things like the violence must stop. We want peace. No. All of this is language which sanitizes the reality of the situation. And the reality of the situation is that Israel has been committing ethnic cleansing for a very long time in Palestine, for 73 years, and it continues to do so. It was stealing our land in 1948. It's still doing so today. And many millions of Palestinians continue to be stateless and be refugees. I don't know if I mentioned, but 8 million of the 13 million Palestinians in the world are refugees. And 1 in 4 refugees are Palestinian. We are the world's largest refugee population. So when Zionists try to say, oh, Palestinians aren't real, or oh, you're just Jordanians, look at the numbers. Why are we all over the world? Why are we stateless? Why are we refugees? Where do we come from? Ask any Palestinian grandmother what her story is, and she will tell you a story about how she was expelled from her homeland in 1948. Ask any Palestinian grandmother. Like that is all of our stories. Either in 1948 or in some sort of event that took place after 1948.
And that's why the media is so important. I remember I believe it was last Ramadan, I watched a show on Netflix called Fauda. I'm sure if you heard about it.
Yeah, it's like super Zionist.
Yes, yeah. So I was on there. Right, you should definitely check it out, because my sister and I were just
I don't
watching.
think I will, but okay.
But so my sister and I were just watching because we were just curious, because it was about Palestine, and what they showed was just all the good about Israel, right? It showed them living in good homes, and the Palestinian people were bothering them, and they were living like beautiful homes, and then the IDF soldiers had to go in and protect the nation, right? To go find the Islamic extremists, right? And then they're like, we're going after Hamas, we're not going after the Palestinian government, and it's crazy because that's how they painted the picture, and that's on Netflix, and that's millions and millions of people looking at it. But now you have social media, right? You have people in Palestine, Palestinians controlling the narrative now, and that shows how much of the media is controlled by Zionists, which I think 100%. Is very crazy, because going from that show on Netflix that had 2-3 seasons now to going back to actually seeing the season, to see what's going on with the Palestinian people from the Palestine. I'm like, whoa, that's not even close as to what you guys were saying, So.
It's the opposite. Look, Zionist logic is just the opposite. Whatever they say, it's the opposite. And there's a reason why Brother Malcolm, when he came back from Palestine, in his trip to Palestine, including Gaza, he wrote this article, and it was called Zionist Logic. And he just flips the whole thing on his head, right? He makes a very clear statement. He says the Zionist argument to justify Israel's present occupation of Arab Palestine has no intelligent or legal basis in history, not even in their own religion, right? Clear as day. Brother Malcolm was ahead of his time, right? I mean, I often think about the work that we have been deprived of, what he would have done if he had stayed with us longer. This is one of the only statements and pieces of his writing that we have where he takes a clear position against Zionism, where he says something about Palestine to begin with, right? But I'm so grateful that he wrote this, right? He talks about, for example, would it make any sense for the Muslims today to go back to southern Spain and start kicking out Spanish people, being like, Muslims were here, so this is our land? It's an absurd notion.
Andalusia, son. Like, yeah, that'd be crazy.
That'd be insane. Nobody would accept that. Nobody would accept that. And, it's insane to me. Like the people who expect us to lay down and die and not defend our homes are literally the first people who, if somebody showed up in their house and was like, I'm taking it, get out, would defend their homes.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
100%. I mean, look, it would be like if Mexico came back and wanted to take the whole West Coast along with Texas and half of America. Like,
you'd be like, what the fuck are you talking about?
They'll start snapping.
Yeah. And they start shooting people.
Well, they're doing that already without anybody.
But you know what I'm saying? Like but they start shooting people to defend their land. But like, we didn't even have that option because we were like, we were completely, resourced by them. They had weapons and money from the British. We were just on our land. That's why, again, making connections to the native story. I want to go back to something that you said earlier about like working in software and the security companies that are all coming out of Israel. This is what people really need to understand about Israel. Yeah, it's a Palestinian issue because we are the main group of people that suffers from their colonial violence and domination. However, it is not limited to Palestinians. The cybersecurity, surveillance, whatever, facial recognition, software, creepy shit that's coming out of Israel is being sold and distributed all over the world. And it is being used in the United States on Black communities.
Same thing in China. That's what they're using on the Uyghur Muslims, from the surveillance that's coming from the Israeli, from Tel Aviv. So,
absolutely. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to say was with respect to the notion that there's like this like Netflix show that is just like pure Zionist propaganda. Israel dedicates many government ministries to disseminating propaganda. And there was an excellent Al Jazeera documentary which revealed a lot of the propaganda that emerges and that is sort of disseminated by the Israeli government. They literally pay people. Like there are actual civil servants who sit in what is known as war rooms, little tiny cubicles behind their desk that are sitting there commenting on social media and getting paid to do it. To comment pro-Israeli things and to flood any Palestinian activist page with like, expletives and flags and, really violent language. I just got off a live today. While I was in the live, there was, 15 or so people that were making threats against my life just for speaking out and telling the same story that I'm telling you, that I was born stateless and a refugee because Zionists stole our land. You know what I mean? Like I can't even tell my story without that. And we had to block them. But these people are paid civil servants, and Israel is very clear on how it needs to control the narrative and the kind of information that gets out about it to the world, which is exactly why in the midst of this great Palestinian uprising, where Palestinians from 1948 are making connections with Palestinians in the West Bank, are making connections with Palestinians in Gaza, are making connections with Palestinians in East Jerusalem, and Palestinians in exile like myself, Israel and its allies have gone absolutely nuts trying to suppress the information that is coming out of Palestine via the Palestinian journalists who are showing us uninterrupted, unedited live footage of what it means to be a Palestinian in Gaza. I cannot tell you for the last few days how many lives I have gotten on just to watch bombs drop on Gaza. I'm seeing it in front of my own eyes.
I'm going to send you this one girl. I forgot. She's I believe a Palestinian storyteller. She goes live every single day, and there's reporters literally on the ground being pushed by the police. They're trying to pray, and then you even see the IDF soldiers trying to throw like grenades, and they're getting caught and putting it back in their pockets and stuff like that. So it's...
Yes, you're seeing images out of occupied East Jerusalem. You're seeing images, coming out of 48. Palestinians are literally being lynched in the streets in what is considered Israel. Those Palestinians that, remained in Israel and live in Israel, what is considered, Israel proper, are literally being lynched in the streets by Jewish Israelis. There are videos, you guys.
Can you tell us what the 48 is?
Yeah, so when Palestinians speak about 48, what they're referring to is that piece of land in the middle that became Israel, right? That's what we call 48 because we lost it in 48. It's the 78% of Palestinian land that we lost in 1948. Then we have the West Bank and Gaza. That makes up the 22% of remaining Palestinian land. So when we speak about 48, it's that 78%, which is considered Israel. And, Israel was not successful in expelling all of the Palestinians from 48. They got rid of most of us. But 20% of the Israeli population today are actually Palestinians who remained on their land and eventually reluctantly had to be integrated into Israeli society. And Israel calls them Arab Israelis to try to erase their identity as Palestinians, but they're really just Palestinians that stayed on their land. They're being lynched in the streets. Their businesses are being completely destroyed. There's videos of all of this, you guys. There's Palestinians being pulled out of cars and beaten. There's peaceful marches happening in Sheikh Jarrah to protest the forced expulsions. They showed up the other day with kites and they were, painting and singing and dancing. And the Israeli soldiers showed up manhandling people and throwing people to the ground. I mean, Israel is revealing for the world what it is. And I want to make a point, which I think is really essential. Israeli brutality goes beyond Palestine. Israeli brutality goes beyond Palestine because I've already given you some examples of the connections between, the brutality that Palestinians experience and how that sort of translates over to the U.S. for, people of color. But also Israel armed and funded apartheid South Africa. Israel, armed and funded massacres in El Salvador and massacres in, South America in the 1980s. Right? Anywhere where there is an authoritarian despot regime that is suppressing its people, Israel is not far, right? That's why you've seen this wave of normalization agreements with these Arab despots like, the UAE and Bahrain, who themselves are despised by their own people, are not democratically elected, are completely dictators, and do not accept any form of dissent within their borders. That's why they're friends with Israel.
And also, I believe the Minnesota Police Department was trained by Israelis, and then the same knee on your neck type of move came from Israel, from one of the IDF soldiers that killed George Floyd. So
it's not just the Minnesota Police Department. The police training programs with Israel are extensive. It is every single police department in America that gets an invite. And there are, documented what we know of. We know that dozens and dozens have taken up this offer, including like Baltimore and Chicago, and certainly Ferguson. For anyone who's interested to learn more about the connection between the oppression of Black people in America as well as the oppression of Palestinian people, I encourage them to read From Ferguson to Palestine, the Angela Davis book that came out in 2014 following the uprising in Ferguson. She explains a lot of those connections. So it's like a modern resurgence of the Black Palestinian solidarity movement that we saw in the 1960s and 70s when Black and Palestinian activists at the time were, united in solidarity along with other members of the third world in their struggle against anti-colonial movements. So we're seeing a maintenance and a resurgence and an affirmation of these efforts at bridging solidarity between oppressed peoples.
And that's what I think you mentioned earlier was really the starting point for what we're seeing now is we've had a year of uprising. We've had a year of resistance. We've had a year of speaking out against oppression of all kinds. And I say this to our own audience that this isn't a Muslim problem. This isn't a Palestinian problem. This is a human problem because when we were going through, our problems here in America, we really needed the support of those outside of here to see that we aren't just hyping up our treatment, right? When we first met, he was like, "Oh, I'm Egyptian. I'm not Black." It was pretty soon that he started realizing he was Black. Being where I'm from, we went to school down where I'm from in Southern Virginia, and we had multiple instances where we're getting stopped by police, we're getting trailed by police, we're getting harassed, and it's like no one really understands that until they see it. Right. And so a year ago, people start seeing there's a pattern here where we're getting killed at a very high disproportionate rate than any other race of people here in this country. Yep. Right. We're being redlined out in neighborhoods. We're basically being separated from everyone else and put in our pocketed space. We're put on pretty much reservations, if you will, within our own cities that a lot of us have nowhere to go, right? And so I think what's happening today, what we're seeing today is a direct correlation between last year's uprising and resistance from white supremacy to today there being a resistance from Zionism, which in my opinion is a larger, is another form of white supremacy, 100%. Just with a whole different veil.
100%. I mean, their own leading human rights organization in Israel, Beit Salem, referred to the regime between the river to the sea as a regime of Jewish supremacy. And I already told you about the nation state law, which essentially enshrines this regime of Jewish supremacy, on the books. I wanted to just add, you talk about how black people in America are, disproportionately murdered. That's exactly what's happening with Palestinians right now. The death ratio is 1 Israeli for 10 to 11 Palestinians. That's insane. That's insane. And most of the Palestinians that have been killed in Gaza in the last, 5 days are women and children. I have a friend who works at the hospital where he's literally receiving the dead and the injured. And he tells me every day, I repost everything that he tells me, every single report that he gives me from on the ground. The other thing you said that, you're being redlined, you're being pushed into certain communities, whatever. Palestinians have been separated as a policy by Israel for 73 years. A Palestinian from the West Bank can't go visit a Palestinian in 48. A Palestinian in 48 can't go visit a Palestinian in Gaza. A Palestinian in Gaza can't go visit a Palestinian in the West Bank. A Palestinian from Jerusalem can't go to 48. I mean, this is the matrix, the web that Israel has, woven that has kept us separated for 73 years. And a Palestinian in exile certainly can't go back to Israel to live, and maybe you'll be able to go back to visit, but not without being subject to harassment, strip search, certain forms of intimidation that will try to essentially make it so that you don't ever want to come back.
What's really interesting? Separation, right? Like as you mentioned that's something that here you wouldn't necessarily be able to recognize, right? Like that's very cut and clear, right? You can't go here. You're barred from here.
You're not allowed.
Yeah, right. I learned this. I was working on a movie called Harriet back in 2018, and I was a Union soldier in this movie, and we did this on a real plantation. So we're out in Virginia. I don't want to use the language on here, but basically we're in the middle of nowhere, the boonies, right?
Yeah.
On this plantation, and I realized that. The stereotype that black people can't swim, it started up because they wouldn't allow us to actually learn how to swim. This plantation I was on was blocked in basically like a square. One side was the river. The other sides were blocked in by other plantations, right? So when we have this notion of, we should have ran and it's like there was nowhere to go and you couldn't swim, right? And now today we're seeing this separation with black people where we've been conditioned over hundreds of years to not leave, to not travel, to not seek a means elsewhere. And we see that, like I see, plenty people I grew up with that never leave because it's just a mentality. It's a totally different type of system, right? That we've experienced, but the effects they're related. I can't say they're the same, but they're related. Like a lot of people don't even consider the fact that they can travel outside the state. Like, how crazy is that? All you need is a car.
Yeah.
Not
if you're Palestinian.
Yeah.
You can't go on that road.
You can't go anywhere. That's crazy.
But here in America, that if you have some money, like if you're black and you have some money, you can't be barred from living in a neighborhood. Right? So I feel like that's a little bit of difference. And here I was talking to a former police officer and he said that, I know what's going on in regards to the police and everything. He said the police don't only target black people, right? They target the poor.
Yeah.
Because that's where the crime is. So if you have a little bit of money, you can get away from that. Obviously, like Kanye said, you get pulled over, I'm still in a coupe. You know what I mean? Still, so, but in the Palestinian, right, sense, it doesn't matter if you have millions. You know what I mean?
No.
You can't really go anywhere. So it's not even a financial place. That's a whole list.
Not at all. Not at all. This is not a financial problem. Palestinians are not subject, they're not victim of some like humanitarian, natural disaster where all they need is, to collect some funds and then their lives will be okay. We're asking the world to stand in solidarity with us to help us dismantle a regime of white supremacy that has subjected us and racialized us and deprived us of our rights and expelled us from our land. I mean, that's essentially what's at stake here. And I want to go back to something that Jabril said earlier, which was, you needed the support of non-Black allies during the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, to be able to capitalize as much as possible on the momentum, right? And to be able to push for as much reform as possible during that time. Because, you know, the news changes, and, you know, what's interesting today might not be interesting tomorrow. And we might go back to the situation that we were in last time, where nobody listened to us. And we were just screaming and screaming, apartheid, 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 and nobody was listening. And right now, people are listening. So it's, you know, again, it's really important that the solidarity that, you know, people from our community extended to Black people, but also to Native people, but, you know, that all of that, it is consistent, and it is, you know, it is exercised in moments like this. And I felt the love, because, like, you know, take for example the clear position of Black Lives Matter. They released a statement calling for an end to settler colonialism. Like, that is exactly what they should have done, and that's exactly what they did. Angela Davis has been like nonstop on, you know, speaking tours right now, talking about the situation, talking about the deep ties between Black and Palestinian activists, and how essential Palestine is to the question of Black liberation. You know, people are, you know, I have my brother Andam in New York, who is Eritrean, and he ran for office, and he's got a pretty good following. He was out speaking in a rally, you know, echoing these same words. This kind of stuff is so essential to us. You have no idea. In every single talk that I have given, in every single interview I have done, I have consistently relied upon the statements of non-Palestinian allies, in particular Black allies.
I want to talk more about the allies. You segue straight into my next question. I think the Muslim world has to wake up. Everybody's like, where's Saudi? Where's Emirates? Where's the UAE?
Don't make me start swearing.
Yeah. But
don't make me start swearing.
So, like, literally, and then I think
you know the answer to that.
Exactly. So we have a very, like, our listeners are all over the world. So I think people need to open up their eyes and understand that we don't need to be waiting on these Muslim nations that are just Muslim, you know, quote unquote, by name. Like, we need to come together as a people. So tell us more about how we can stay in solidarity. What should we do? Who should we boycott? I saw something today and yesterday. Today was by the Kuwaiti government. If you support the Zionist movement, you will be jailed for 10 years. Then I saw
sorry?
In Kuwait, if you support the Zionist movement or anything that's related to Zionism, you will be jailed for 10 years in Kuwait.
Yeah, Kuwait has always, I mean, Kuwait in recent years has had our back, and this, especially, you know, a lot of Kuwaiti intellectuals, Dr. Tariq Swaydan, his daughters, Mafaza Swaydan, who's doing her PhD at Harvard, big allies of Palestinian liberation. They have been doing this work for a long time, especially Dr. Tariq Swaydan. I mean, he's written so much on the issue, and he's been out doing the lives as well. So Kuwait right now for sure has our back. But, you know, unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the rest of these so-called Muslim governments. And the fact of the matter is that, let's be honest, these Muslim governments are not upholding the principles of Islam.
They haven't been for a while. Let's be real about it.
Not only about the question of Palestine, right? But in every way. I mean, they steal from their people. They are dictators. They are, you know, in bed with the United States. They are, look at Egypt. I mean, look at how many people are in jail and executed just for dissenting and having opinions that are unpopular political opinions. I mean, if I was in Egypt and I was making these sorts of statements, right, about the Egyptian government, I was an outspoken critic of the Egyptian government, I would be dead or in prison for the rest of my life.
For 20 years.
Oh, we would have been dead after episode 5. Episode 5, they were like, shut it down.
Like, of course these people are not standing with Palestine because they don't support liberation for their own people.
Sheesh.
Wow.
Hey, I think we're going to clip that. We're going to clip that and put that on Instagram or something, because that was good. That was nice.
But that's a fact, right? That's a fact. I mean, look at Bahrain. People were protesting in Bahrain. They ended up being put on death row. And my law firm was involved in appealing to the United Nations to try to intervene to protect these Bahraini activists, right? There's so many examples where simple acts of, exercising your freedom of speech, your freedom of organization, freedom of association, any of the freedoms that we would traditionally associate with, a democracy that respects liberal values and, diversity in thought, just simply don't exist in the Arab world. And we fought and we struggled for this and we had an Arab Spring, but it didn't matter because in the end, we ended up with worse than what we had before in most of the countries, right?
Yeah, except for, I think Sudan might have did the best, but I was telling Jibril about that in Egypt. We did all that fighting, next thing you know,
to end up with
somebody
Sisi?
worse. We got somebody worse. Exactly. So.
You did all that fighting and end up with Sisi? And let me be very clear right here. Gaza is being put under a military and land blockade by Israel, but it is also being put under the same, Gaza is being put under a land and sea blockade by Israel, but it is also being put under a land and sea blockade by Egypt. Egypt is 100% responsible for the condition of Palestinian people in Gaza. 100%. They could end the siege if they wanted to by opening the border and allowing Palestinians to go into Egypt to buy goods. And you know who did that? No. You know who did that for a period of a year and a half or so before they threw him in a prison and murdered him? Yes. Yeah. He opened the border and Gaza had a little bit of relief during that time and people were able to get in and go out and live like human beings, not like cattle. And then, what did the powers that be say in Egypt? No, you can't do that. Palestinians are meant to die. They are meant to rot in, what is referred to as the world's largest open air prison. And so when Sisi comes to power, he immediately, one of the first things that he does is reenacts the siege, the blockade of Gaza.
Hey, Laura, really quick, Laura, just for reference, how big is Gaza? Like, if there's any state that you could compare it to, what's like the size of it?
You're gonna have to cut this because I need to
look. We keep it all in. We're gonna keep all this in. This is like people are getting drawn in. This is like the climax of the podcast right now.
So Gaza, it's 365 kilometers squared. It's very small. It's important for people to understand that it is more densely populated than Manhattan. So when a bomb drops in the center of Gaza, and they have been dropping every minute for the last 5 days. And I know this for a fact because I have been on these lives and I have listened to the bombs drop I have listened to the bombs drop every minute, every single minute. There's, you can hear the drones, you hear the F-16 flying overhead, and then you hear the explosion. That's, it's criminal what they are doing. They are essentially, think about this, okay? What Israel has done with the people in Gaza. First, the Zionists stole their land in 1948. They made them refugees. They kicked them out of their houses. They moved in. They literally didn't even change the furniture. We have a phrase in Arabic, "Akhaduha mafrusha." It means they took it fully furnished. They literally kept our furniture. They didn't even change it. Okay, that's what happens in 1948. Those people get expelled down into Gaza. Then they become refugees, and they live in refugee camps for most of their life. My brother-in-law's family, who is in Gaza, who I have spoken about a lot on my page, and whose apartment was hit by a missile by Israel 2 days ago. They spent most of their life in a refugee camp in Gaza until they were able to get enough money to move out into an apartment in Gaza. Now, for the last 15 years, you have been subject in Gaza to this land and sea blockade where nothing goes in, nothing goes out. Before that, there were Jewish settlers settling in Gaza from 1967 until 2005. Right? So your land was also being colonized that way. Then they removed the Jewish settlers, they put them all on the West Bank. And the moment that they start doing that, they start attacking Gaza from above because they know that there's no more Jewish people in Gaza. So that's the moment in time when the policy towards Gaza changes and that the genocide starts to be carried out by aerial bombardment. And then you live through 3 or 4 military assaults where thousands of people are murdered, where infrastructure, is completely destroyed. These attacks on buildings look like planned demolitions. They literally turn the buildings into dust in a matter of moments, guys. Yesterday, when they attacked the Al Jazeera and the Associated Press building, it turned to dust in a minute. And the Israeli government, of course, defended the decision to, drop bombs on the Associated Press building and the Al Jazeera building because they said, oh, Hamas. And the Associated Press said what? They said, there's no Hamas here. Al Jazeera said what? They said, there's no Hamas here. And the U.S. said what? The Secretary of State said, yeah, we actually have no evidence that Hamas was there either. But guess what? It doesn't fucking matter because Israel gets away with everything.
But then Joe Biden came out and said that, hey, we support Israel in defending themselves. So how does the Secretary of State say one thing and then the president come out and
we just had Trump and Corona fighting Dr. Fauci. You think there's not going to be back and forth within the same administration? They're crazy.
People need to understand that when you're Palestinian, it makes absolutely no difference who's in office because the policy does not change. Ethnic cleansing continues. Israel's expansionist policies continue, and Israel continues to build settlements. The greatest settlement growth happened under who?
Obama?
Yeah. Yes.
Figured that.
Who's the guy that approved the $38 billion aid package to Israel over 10 years, which is the largest aid package in history?
Oh, dog.
Yes. That's your boy.
He ain't my boy.
You know what I mean? Like that. People think, oh, but Obama's so great, and Obama, first black president. Well, Obama ruined our lives as Palestinians. Obama did absolutely nothing to support our cause for liberation. He's a phony.
So, and I feel almost a little weird asking these questions because I know like this.
No, don't feel weird. Ask anything.
Not weird, but I know these are very like personal in a way. But like, what's the difference? Like, it's 2021. What has been the difference in, say, from now to 2011 to even like 2001? Has there been like this crazy big difference, or has everything relatively just been the same throughout?
I mean, look, you have moments where, there is pockets of resistance to the colonial oppression, right? You know, we can look back at the Great March of Return when Palestinian refugees in Gaza symbolically tried to walk back to their former, cities and villages that they were expelled from. And of course, they were shot by Israel, and Israel murdered hundreds of people as they were like peacefully marching towards the border. That happened in 2018. And they also targeted medics. They targeted many civilians, people who are disabled, using snipers. Very brutal. There was, of course, the first and second Intifada, which were also other moments of Palestinian uprising. There's always going to be moments of uprising, right? Even in a moment of calm, it's never really calm because the system of oppression is still in place, right? So, but what we're seeing now, I think, is really different because what Palestinians are doing right now is they are reaffirming that, there is no difference between a Palestinian in Gaza or a Palestinian in 48 or a Palestinian from occupied, Jerusalem or occupied West Bank or a Palestinian in exile. And this has been very clearly demonstrated by the organization, the activism, the resistance, the creativity, the ingenuity, the sheer energy that we are seeing of Palestinians harnessing the power of independent media and social media platforms. Even if our lives cut, even if you erase our stories, you block our accounts, we don't care. We're going to create backup accounts. We're going to keep going and just trying as much as possible to get the word out about the Palestinian struggle for liberation, which is an anti-colonial struggle against apartheid and ethnic cleansing. And, I have been heavily censored. I like the extent to which I have been censored, you guys, in the last week. Every single function on Instagram doesn't work. And I am getting error messages that I have never seen before. I am getting hundreds, literally no exaggeration, hundreds of messages from people saying, I can't share your posts. I can't see your stories. You used to be first on my stories. Now you're in the back. I can't see your profile at all. It disappears for hours at a time. I can't see your lives. I can only see your lives at the end. Once your live is saved, I can't share your live. My live's cut out. I tried to start a live this morning, with no name. Wouldn't start. I titled it Skincare, and it immediately started.
I actually hopped on that one. I was like, hold on, she's talking about skincare.
Nope. Yeah. Literally just because I'm being subject to censorship.
It changed, that conversation changed very quickly. And I think I was looking at the comments, certain people was like, oh, she's not talking about skincare. I was like...
I'm talking about fucking care at all, but I'm just trying to avoid the censorship of the news that I have to report. And look, I just want to be very clear about this. This is not an accident. This is not something that I'm just like, it's not just like a weird glitch. By the way, Instagram came out and said it was a glitch. There were several reports in different media outlets. The Politico reported that Facebook met with Israeli officials to discuss quote unquote online hate speech. And what constitutes online hate speech for them, for us, constitutes showing the world Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity, right? Also, Israel's justice minister asked TikTok and Facebook to remove posts that incited violence against the country. Right. So again, what is a post that incites violence? Is it somebody who's literally telling their story about how they became a refugee and how they have no rights? There's also another article that was published by The Intercept last week about how Facebook and Instagram limit and censor and delete and block content which is critical of Zionists, because the Zionists have been successful in lobbying to equate Zionism with Judaism. So anytime you speak out about Zionism, you're automatically labeled an anti-Semite. You're automatically told that you hate Jews, which of course couldn't be further from the truth, because as I've already told you, many of the strongest comrades that we have in this fight for Palestinian liberation are Jewish. Take a look at Jewish Voice for Peace, the Jewish American organization. They have a strong anti-Zionist position on their platform. Take a look at all those people that I've mentioned previously. Take a look also at the fact that, the former Israeli ambassador to the U.S. has said that, yeah, so it looks like we're losing the PR game a little bit with the Jewish Americans. I think we should refocus our efforts on the evangelical Christians, right? So the notion that you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist, and, you can be a Christian, right? And not every Jew is a Zionist. A lot of them are anti-Zionist, whether they are secular or Orthodox. And I mean, there's plenty of Orthodox examples as well. Rabbi Shapiro out of New York is one that I cite to consistently, because he has produced a heavy body of scholarship dissecting Zionism and basically ripping it apart and saying this has nothing to do with Judaism. But there's many more where that came from. He's just one out of many.
Can you educate us a little bit on the flag? I was talking to Jabril about that earlier. I see that the Muslims, or anybody that has that white and blue flag, like they attack them and consider them Zionists. Can you give us a little bit of history about the flag?
About their flag?
Like, for example, anybody carrying that flag, are they considered Zionists? Like here in America, we have the American flag, and then we have the Confederate flag too.
The Israeli flag is the equivalent of the Confederate flag, because the Israeli flag represents Zionism, and Zionism represents white supremacy.
And that's why I asked earlier if there's a difference between a Zionist and an Israeli. But I mean, in listen to what you're saying, like there has to be, because there's people that are born and they're Israeli, and there's like they don't have anything to do with Zionism.
Right. So remember, like, you can be a Christian Zionist, and the majority of Zionists in the United States actually are Christian Zionists. They're like people who adhere to the teachings of John Hagee, who's an absolute psychopath. Just look up some of this guy's teachings. He believes that, and he tells his congregation to support the state of Israel so that they can help accelerate the second coming and the coming of the Messiah. It's like, God doesn't need your help. You know what I mean? Like, he doesn't need, like, he created everything. You think he needs you to like interfere and meddle with like politics so that you can, do your part?
It's like what John said. He's trying to hurry this up. Let me make it happen.
You know what I mean? So that's the first thing. Yeah. The second thing is that there's a reason why we saw Israeli flags at Trump rallies. There's a reason. Mm-hmm. Because they're one and the same. They represent the same right-wing, extreme, white nationalist, white supremacist ideology. And I mean, if you just Google like interviews with Israelis, Abby Martin did one. The great journalist Abby Martin did one in the street. Max Blumenthal has done interviews with Israelis in the street. Ask them about what they actually think. Some pretty genocidal stuff comes out of their mouths. Yeah. And people say, oh, these are just right-wing Israelis. The fact of the matter is that the Times of Israel, one of Israel's own newspapers, reported in 2019 that Israeli society is one of the only societies in the world where the younger generation is actually more right-wing and more conservative and, more nationalistic than the generation that came before it. Yes. So,
bro, I feel like people in our generation, maybe not our generation, but maybe the one right under us, right, Gen Z. I feel like a lot of them are actually more racist. Because because you got to think about it. It's not coming out of ignorance. The information is here. You're going to school with these people. You're not going through segregation. Yeah. You're choosing to be racist. You aren't born into these situations where you have no information. Like, if you want to be a Zionist, you want to be a Zionist. Like, you're choosing that pathway. One of the things that I think is probably the hardest struggle for both of our plights, but especially for the Palestinian fight, right, which I take on as my own fight as well, is the education that comes behind it. And trying to get people to understand what a Zionist is, trying to get people to understand what's going on. And basically everything we've talked about, it's like the education is so difficult to get that out there. How can we do more than just share posts to try and help people understand, like, very subtly, like, yo, this is wrong. How can we go about that?
Well, look, I mean, I think it's critical to share information, because the truth of the matter is once people start to understand what Israel's all about, it's about, bombing journalists and bombing doctors while they sleep and bombing main roads, the main road that, connects Doctors Without Borders to the hospital, bombing infrastructure, bombing a medicine factory, bombing civilians while they sleep, maybe giving them, a few minutes notice, maybe not. My family was lucky enough to get notice, but they ran out of the building with seconds to spare, with no shoes, no hijab, right? That's, that happened to my family a few days ago, right? So the more that people start to actually have access to this information, the clearer it becomes that this is nothing that anybody who's like liberal and supports universal human values and has like respect for human dignity should be supporting. It's just like it's not complicated, right? People always wanted to use this language of, it's a conflict, whatever, both sides. That's just simply not true. The proper terminology is settler colonialism, it's apartheid, it's ethnic cleansing, and it's genocide. And so that's why it's essential for us to really try to amplify Palestinian voices and get this information out, because we are up against a major propaganda machine, as I've already explained, which is official and also, unofficial, right? It's coming out of the government and its ministries, but it's also, being propagated by crazed Zionists just that have a lot of time to harass Palestinians online. So that's number one. Number two is, people say, well, like, what can I do to help Palestinians? Well, yeah, you can definitely donate. And there's some great organizations that are doing work on the ground. Palestine Children's Relief Fund is one. There's a few others, and I have a highlight where I place information about places to donate. But more than anything, Palestinians want political solidarity. They want people to make clear statements, standing up and condemning settler colonialism, standing up and condemning Jewish supremacy, listening to Palestinians, understanding that what a Palestinian family has gone through in the last 3 generations has been nothing short of tragic. I always tell people, like, Israel ruined my life. Zionism ruined my life. It deprived me of my identity, my ability to grow up and live on the land that my grandparents were born, my cultural knowledge, my religious knowledge. I don't know my culture, my language, my religion as good as I would have had I been, born and raised in Palestine. They deprived me even of something simple, like just like the generational wealth that my family would have accumulated if we didn't become refugees twice.
SubhanAllah, you mentioned the one thing that you guys want, political solidarity. And that's the one thing that people aren't willing to give. And what I mean by that is on social media, people will dance around it, right? They may say, I see this going on, but they won't, like you said, they won't make a straight up statement. I know it's hard to generalize, and we see these huge platforms, but can we expect them to do that even though the media is ran by, quote unquote, the Zionists and the jobs online? They may be in the music industry, they may be there, or like you mentioned, the one thing that you guys are asking, they're not willing to give.
Well, look, I have seen a shift. I have seen a shift in the last week. I've seen a greater shift in the last week than I've seen in the last 10 years in terms of the public awareness of, what Israel is and what it's doing. But I think this is where we need to hold all of ourselves accountable, right? And we need to understand that, again, Israel's brutality goes beyond its borders, and it's going to have an impact. And that impact is going to reverberate throughout the world, and it's going to lead to a world that is just fundamentally less just in general. And so I fundamentally believe in the idea of each one teach one. I really do, because that's how it starts. You know, you tell someone who tells someone who tells someone. And once you understand what this is all about, like I saw this meme that was like, once you tell Black folk like what Palestine's about, they're like, damn, well, free Palestine then, you know?
Yeah, exactly. 100%. You have to. You know what I mean? You have to. It's like, we'll take your black card if you don't. It's a real thing. We will take it.
Yeah. Like that's what Palestine's about. So yeah, I mean, everybody has to do their part in speaking up and calling it what it is. And yeah, it's not easy. I mean, look at Trevor Noah. He literally lived under apartheid South Africa, and he came out there with his joke ass video saying, "Oh, it's complicated," and it's like it's really not that complicated. It's just racial supremacy, and you should know a thing or two about it.
That's wild. I haven't seen that. That's crazy.
No, he started off a little like wishy-washy. I watched the whole thing, but he actually, I'll give him props. He did a good job because nobody else out of all the reporters.
John Oliver did a better piece. It still wasn't perfect. But the truth is anyone who's going to say the words "it's complicated" at any point in time in this discussion has already lost me, because it's not complicated. Because it all goes back to they stole our land. And if I were to come up to your house and say, "Jabril, get out of your house. God gave it to me," you would be like, "You're crazy." You'd be like, "Get the fuck out of my house."
No, God gave me this. What? But isn't there that line though that someone, let's take Trevor Noah, right? We'll even take someone like DJ Khaled, for example.
He's a joke.
All right, I'm with you, right? But for these people who are in these industries that are basically run by Jews, right? Trevor Noah's check is signed by someone in that pecking order that is a Zionist, right? How do you straddle that line? How do you straddle that line of being able to speak out, and then you're just like, yo, your livelihood is completely shot at that point. You know what I'm saying? So I'm not saying they were in the right, but it's also like it's a weird line that you almost have to kind of, not saying you have to appease, but you got to speak out without fully speaking out.
Look, I mean, the point that you make about livelihood is essential, right? Because what you're really saying is that this work is very risky, and that what they do is they blacklist people who speak out in support of Palestinian rights. I mean, look what they did to Mark Lamont Hill. He lost his job. He lost his job overnight at CNN. He was, I
didn't know that.
Yeah, you didn't know that, bro. You did? Like him and what was it, Jamila?
I forget.
She worked for ESPN.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Overnight, because he was at the United Nations and he gave a speech where he used the word "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And what do we mean when we say that? We mean we want to have our rights. We want to be able to have all full economic, civil, political rights. We want to be able to exercise our right of return, which is our right under international law as refugees to be able to go back to our homeland. You know, why is that a threat? Right? The fact that the fact that we don't live with rights, that's the issue. The fact that we're calling for, the enforcement of our rights, like that's what's absurd. Is like the script is always flipped when it comes to Zionists. But you're absolutely right. The work is risky. I mean, Zionists targeted Professor Steve Salaita, who was one of our guests on our podcast, and they went after him for some tweets that he made in the summer of 2014 during Israel's military assault on Gaza, where he was speaking out against the massacre that was happening, and he got fired. Listen to this irony. A professor and a scholar of Native American studies with a PhD from the University of Oklahoma in Native American studies, right, is fired from the University of Illinois in a tenured position where he's supposed to lead the Department of Native American Studies and talk about settler colonialism all day.
But within this box.
Yo, that's crazy.
Because there's probably some people listening, right? They're probably just like, well, if the Zionists don't want the Palestinians to be there, right?
Yeah.
Why don't they just leave, right? So tell us more about the infrastructure.
Why wouldn't who just leave?
For example, they're probably just like, well, if the Zionists are doing all this and killing the Palestinians, like they're being killed every single day, why don't you just get on the plane and just leave, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there's two reasons. One, we can't. Like, people in Gaza can't leave. They're sealed in. People in the West Bank can't leave really either. It's very difficult for Palestinians to actually leave, right? They just get kind of, more restricted in the areas of physical space that they can inhabit. But there's something even, more essential than this that we have to keep in mind. Why would a Palestinian leave his land? We are an extremely resilient people, and we are a people that would rather die with dignity on our land than leave our land, out of choice. So no matter how hard the situation gets for the people in Palestine, they won't leave. They're not going anywhere. And the Palestinians like myself who were expelled and we had no choice, we couldn't come back. We weren't allowed to come back, right? Well, we're fighting every single day in our lives to dismantle settler colonialism from abroad. That's my life's mission. That's my life's mission, is to dismantle this regime of racial supremacy that reigns in the place where my grandmother was born.
So then what is the ideal outcome for the Palestinian people with everything that's going on? What would you all like to have happen?
Simple. We want to be able to go back to our land and we want to have equal rights. It's not crazy. Do I sound radical? Do I sound like a radical extremist, jihadist? We just want equal rights and we want to be able to go back to our land. And we want the injustices that were committed against us to be acknowledged. In South Africa, there was this Truth and Reconciliation Committee. There was this notion that, okay, in order for us to dismantle this regime of racial supremacy, we have to first admit what went wrong and set the record straight. So there needs to be some sort of reconciliation between Palestinians and Zionists, where the Zionists say, we're sorry that we've been ethnically cleansing you for 73 years. We're sorry that we stole your land. We're sorry that we made you stateless refugees for 3 generations. We're sorry that we deprived you of billions of dollars of wealth, that we stole your real property, that we took what was inside your homes, that, we took your books. Like, there are articles about how they took thousands of books that used to belong to the Ottomans and that are now sitting somewhere in like Hebrew University or whatever, if they didn't burn them, right? They took our cultural artifacts. Like, there needs to be some sort of like a admission on the part of Zionists in order for this healing to begin. And then we need to have our rights.
100%, right? And I ask what I'm asking, coming from a place of understanding. How likely do you feel that is that Zionists will say, all right, we're going to give you land back, or you can come back? Like, in my eyes, I don't think that I'm cynical, but I look at the situation like we have here, situation what's going on there, and I say, is it really likely that will happen? Being treated equal, I think that is like, yes, that is 120% what needs to happen. It can happen, but the likelihood of settlers receding back and it's like the white people giving back the land to Native Americans. Like, do I think it's going to happen? No.
Well, let's be clear. Some Native people did get their land back. And there are stories of, Native tribes that have been successful in struggling for getting their land back. Okay. It has happened. There are success stories. It's not this, completely dark history where everybody has been exterminated. There are Native people today that continue to live and struggle for land back, right? I think the key thing to keep in mind is that no regime of racial supremacy is ever going to voluntarily relinquish the power structures that it has put in place, right? No colonial power is ever going to end colonialism because it feels like it, because it highly benefits from the situation. Look at what happened with our brothers and sisters in Algeria. 150 years they lived under French colonial rule, but they freed themselves. We've been under colonial rule now for 73 years, if we're counting from the Zionists, and basically 100 years if you're counting since British colonialism, right? But my point here is that every colonial regime will see the day that it falls. It's just not a sustainable form of governance. And the way that these, colonial states fall is because what happens is there is a shift in the political consciousness, which makes it more costly to support them than it is to back off, right? It's like a cost-benefit analysis, where right now, Israel and America are able to keep the status quo going. The U.S. just regurgitates, we support a two-state solution, Israel has the right to defend itself, and it does nothing else but just send Israel money and weapons every year, and, Israel does whatever the hell it wants in occupied Palestinian land. But the thing is that the public consciousness is changing whether Israel likes it or not. So the fact that in the last year you have had two leading human rights organizations come out with hundreds of pages of evidence and reports that conclude that Israel is running a state according to Jewish supremacy and is guilty of the crime of apartheid and persecution, and that Israel has not responded at all on the merits, right? They have nothing to say on the merits. All they've done is said, we disagree. These are anti-Semitic lies, right? The case that's brought by Palestinians against Israel in the International Criminal Court, which is another means by which Palestinians are seeking to obtain some sort of accountability, which is pending right now. You know, what did Benjamin Netanyahu say? He said, oh, this is just anti-Semitic. Is it anti-Semitic really for Palestinians to go before an international body for having suffered, you know, war crimes and crimes against humanity and trying to seek redress? Is that really anti-Semitic? I mean, is that, because if that's anti-Semitic, what does that say about Judaism? That Judaism equals ethnic cleansing? I mean, this is why my Jewish friends that are anti-Zionist are absolutely enraged, because they feel that what Israel has done is it has managed to equate murder and genocide and ethnic cleansing with the religion. It's like, these are not values of the Jewish religion, which is a beautiful religion. And I always give this example. I think it's helpful. It's like Muslims have existed for 1400 years, right? And like a few decades ago or whatever, ISIS shows up and they're like, hey, we're the real Muslims. And we're like, no, what are you talking about? We have no idea who you are. You know what I mean? Like, we literally have no idea who you guys are. You guys just got here and you literally don't uphold any of the principles of Islam. You don't even read the Quran and you murder everyone. So we literally have no idea who you are. That's how my Jewish anti-Zionist friends feel about Zionism in Israel. They're like, these guys showed up. They walk around claiming to be Jewish. They, completely silence anyone who is critical of them on the basis that they're anti-Semites. And they basically are creating this bizarre, you know, logical reality where, like, if you criticize Israel, you're an anti-Semite, but that means that, like, Israel and Judaism are the, you know, the same thing, which means that Judaism is equivalent to ethnic cleansing and, you know, war crimes. So it's just like this absurd reality, which for them has, you know, they're dedicating their entire lives to dismantle it because it's personal, right? And in the same way that you have Muslims that will speak out against ISIS, you also have people that don't, because they're like, that has nothing to do with me. Why would I even speak out about it?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, the biggest thing that you had mentioned was solidarity, right? And I see all the Palestinians come together right now, and which makes me so happy. It makes me so just joyful. Here in America, when Obama got in office, he didn't pass one law for black people. And we had an attorney general that was black. For 8 years, he came in, went out, nothing, right? Then now, you know, this may upset some people, the LGBTQ community was getting killed, was getting murdered. Joe Biden came into office and did what? Right away, made laws for them, right? Mm-hmm. Both. The LGBTQ, Joe Biden passed laws. And then the Asian community started getting killed. There was some Asian hate. Joe Biden went ahead and passed laws for them the next day. But not even the George Floyd, it's been over a year, even the George Floyd bill has not passed yet. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So they know that the Asian community can come together and make some waves. They know that the LGBTQ community can come together and make some waves, but they're very confident that the black people won't.
Well, I have my own theory on that. And again, we'll look back at history. If you look at the civil rights movement, there was a lot of protesting going on for years and years and years. Mm-hmm. But what really sparked it was the Montgomery bus boycott. It was an economic boycott and sit-ins that really like made the white supremacists raise their eyebrows and say, okay, we need to start changing some things. Mm-hmm. And that's when you get, you know, what we all know in the history books, right? And as you just mentioned, look at the two groups. The LGBTQ community have some of the strongest buying power in the country. The Asian community, they have some of the strongest buying power as a collective, you know, continent. You know, when we say Asian, we mean all of Asia. Like, their buying power, specifically in America and in the islands, is unmatched, right? So when you look at black people in America, our collective buying power, our purchasing power, our producing power isn't unified. As you said, it's not solid. So
I think it's deeper than that, though. I think it's deeper than that, because it's like, Yes, certainly. We have had a history of oppression against, LGBTQ people in America for decades. That's not new. And same with Asian Americans, obviously Japanese internment camps. I mean, there's plenty of examples to draw from, right? But the situation with Black Americans is different because it goes back to the inception of the state itself, right? Like it goes back to the inception of the state itself. You have to, in order to properly address the injustices that Black people have faced over, these many, many, many generations since they were kidnapped from their houses and, forced onto ships and made slaves. And they were scholars and they were community members and they were brilliant people, right? You have to go back to the beginning. And it's not any president that's, going to want to spearhead that form of, justice. I think it's easier for Biden to be like, oh yeah, I'll pass some laws to help LGBTQ and I'll pass some laws to help Asians to deal with this like isolated incident of, Asian hate crimes that arises out of, what we're seeing with COVID. But to start correcting the injustices that our Black, brothers and sisters have lived through, it really requires going back to the beginning. And I don't know that anybody is like, I don't see Joe Biden being the guy to lead that, struggle. I don't know. What do you think? Like, do you think that makes sense what I said?
No. I mean, no, that makes a lot of sense. That makes perfect sense. And like you said, it is a lot deeper than where I was looking at. I was looking at like, oh, look, like plain and simple, we don't have the money. They're not there's no incentive for them. Right. But you're right. The incentive also isn't there because, like you said, that is a mountain that has to be climbed, and no one wants to climb that Mount Everest. Yeah, because it's very slippery. And Obama actually came out and spoke about that, why he didn't grant reparations, and he literally said that.
He said that
exactly what you said. Literally exactly what you said. He was like, if I came in and tried to do reparations, he was like, I would have been blocked at every step of the way. So he said I couldn't. So I know that it was the most political answer possible.
At least some tax
But
benefits.
when he was saying it, what you said, right? Come on now. Like what you said, it sparked that same sort of, light in my head when he was talking.
Yeah.
He wasn't willing to take that on. Yeah. It's like Dave Chappelle said, I don't want to be the first Black president.
It's just like laziness. It's like, I don't want to be the one. It's a lot of work. It's much easier to maintain the status quo than it is to, drive a revolution. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but it's like Dave Chappelle said, I don't want to be the first Black president. Maybe the second. I don't want to be the first though.
For sure.
My vice president gonna be Hispanic.
Yeah, he was like, my vice president's gonna be named Santiago. You kill me, he's gonna open up the border. Isn't that right, Santiago? See.
Right.
So yeah, like I definitely agree with what you said. I think it's a situation here where it's deeper than reparations. It's deeper than, simply passing some laws. They've done things to our people, especially over the last 50 years, that's been so deep rooted that you can't put your finger on it. Right. I mean, we can go back to the 80s with the war on drugs. Mm-hmm. Something like that is affecting kids to this day. Is affecting people's psyche to this day, how we treat one another. I mean, you look at mass incarceration, like it's something where it's like you said, you can justify it because it's by law, right? When you look at the 3/5 rule, it's the same thing. It's still in the Constitution. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people act like slavery was something that was so far long ago. Like I have great grandparents who were enslaved. You know what I'm saying? Like when I knew my great grandmother. Yeah. So are you telling me her parents and their siblings or whoever possibly could have been enslaved or were enslaved is not that far removed. And I think a lot of times we think that the things that happen in this country, they just happen, then they're gone, but the effects of them are no longer there. Like they're unseen, but we feel it every day.
And another thing that I think is important is that because the U.S. funds the Zionist movement, what can we do to stop that? Because we have to pay taxes. Right. Yeah. That's one thing we have to do is pay tax. Yeah. We can't stop paying tax or you already know what's going to happen.
No, you can't stop paying taxes. You'll go to jail. That's That's a federal crime.
Exactly. Tax evasion. They got a lot of
See,
people.
that's why she went to France. That's why she.
I don't pay taxes in the U.S. anymore. 100%. I don't, because I would have to if I made enough money to, but I don't. So the thing is now I just pay taxes in France. But at some point when you make enough money, then they make you pay taxes in both places. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But the thing is, it's very clear like what you can do. Palestinians, civil society has put out a call in 2005 for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. That is the grassroots movement to support Palestinian human rights. And it
The
was,
BDS?
Can you say that again?
I think it's BDS.
BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And we were inspired by the model that worked in South Africa to help end apartheid. Because what happened in South Africa was that a mass boycott movement grew, and it reached the level where South Africa was completely blacklisted. Like they weren't even allowed to participate in the Olympics anymore. They just were cut out from all international events, and they weren't able to diplomatically engage with countries. So that's what helped bring down apartheid in South Africa. So Palestinian civil society was inspired by that. And they put out a mass call, hundreds of organizations banded together, and they said, hey, we're calling on people to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel, meaning, you boycott companies that are involved in Palestinian oppression. And there's lists of companies that you can look at. You can look, for example, at the UN list that was published earlier, I think this year or maybe the year before, where the UN actually lists the companies that operate on illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and you boycott them. And, Israel tried very hard to prevent the publication of this list by the UN. You can look up the UN settlement list. You can find it online. Boycott all those companies. Airbnb is on there. Booking.com is on there. I think there's a few US and European companies that are on there that would be easy to boycott for Americans that are listening to this podcast. But not only that, right? There's other, local BDS initiatives that are probably taking place in your city. So, look up the local BDS chapter that operates in your city and see what they're doing and what they're involved with and help them. That's something that you can do that will concretely support Palestinian human rights and the struggle for a liberated Palestine. The divestment thing, there have been some huge wins where companies have divested their investments from Israeli companies that support oppression of Palestinians. The sanction piece is a little bit more difficult because we're not very close to sanctions right now. You know what I mean? Like we are giving Israel more money than we give anyone else, much less conditioning that aid, much less ending that aid, much less imposing sanctions, which is like the last step. Right now, the money that we give Israel is carte blanche, no conditions, do whatever you want with it.
Well, that's what I thought was interesting, because I saw a lot of people say, oh, we need to reach out to our reps and tell them to add sanctions. I was like, listen, you're asking a white supremacist based system to put sanctions on another white supremacist based. It's not going to happen. So what you're saying, boycotting is what I feel is the only solution forward because it has to. You said something earlier, and him and I actually had a really big, I would say argument. It was an argument about this, where we were saying that responsibility for getting things out has to be on influencers, his side. I was saying it has to be the individuals. So I was actually going in on our listeners and in on our followers. We were supposed to record on that. We decided against it. But I was saying it's on the responsibility of the individual listener, not these people that have 1 million followers. Who are they? They're one person, but you take each of their followers and have them say something about it. It is way bigger than that one person could ever be. You know what I'm saying? So it's like if boycotting is the way forward, in my opinion, that has more impact than us saying, let's talk to our congressman or congresswoman. That's one person.
I mean, look, everything needs to be done. Everything needs to be done all the time, right? You can't exclude any, form of resistance. But let's be clear that, we're not going to free Palestine through the United States Congress. That's not going to happen. You know what I mean? Like, let me just give you a quick example. I'll just give you a very quick example. Representative Betty McCollum, who is a very sweet representative woman. She's amazing. Love her. She has been trying for the last several years to propose bills that would make it illegal for Israel to use the money that we give it to lock up Palestinian children. to make Palestinian children political prisoners. Yes, Israel does arrest Palestinian children. They pick them up in nightly raids in the occupied West Bank. They show up, they kidnap them, they throw them in the back of a military vehicle. They will interrogate them in Hebrew without a lawyer, without their parents. They don't understand. They make them sign confessions that they don't understand. They torture them. This is all documented, right? They can lock them up for 6 months at a time without any of the traditional safeguards, of due process that we would expect from a normal democratic system. Well, first of all, we wouldn't expect that a normal democratic system would jail children, but here we are, right? And all she wanted to do was a law that would say that, hey, Israel, the money that we give you, you can't use it to lock up Palestinian children. She introduced that bill multiple times. Each time it died in committee. Democrats can't even get on board to support the notion that it's highly illegal to jail Palestinian children. Even that is too controversial for Democrats at this point in time. So please don't tell me that I'm supposed to vote for a Democrat to free Palestine. I mean, look, Joe Biden, amidst this genocide that Gaza is facing right now, approved a $735 million weapons sale that will go out to Israel on May 25th, 2021. So we all need to raise hell, harass our representatives, and call on them to intervene. Israel is literally committing a genocide before our eyes. We saw that it targeted news. We saw that it targeted families while they were sleeping. We saw that it targeted roads and, refugee camps and cemeteries. They literally bombed cemeteries in Gaza, right? Like, why is the U.S. sending Israel more weapons while it's committing a genocide? So this is like a point in time where I say, yeah, call your representative, raise hell, because at least from, honestly, like if your listeners are Muslim, at least from an Islamic point of view, from like a, okay, I'm good with my Lord point of view, you have to raise hell about this. Like, this right now. So you have to write a letter. You have to send a tweet. You have to send an email to your representative and say, look, Israel's been committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza for the last week. It's been dropping missiles, bombs on people, F-16s, drones, all sorts of crazy advanced, weaponry and machinery. Why are you selling it more weapons to commit more war crimes? Right? That's like a way that we need to use our voice right now. But like I said, it's not, the ultimate liberation of Palestine is never going to happen through the U.S. Congress. That's going to happen because the Palestinian people free themselves. And I think the Palestinian people have shown us in the last week that they are going to free themselves. They're not going to wait for Europe or the U.S., which can barely, assemble like a sentence in favor of their, right to self-defense, right? The spokesperson for the Secretary of State, his name is Ned Price, and he started sweating when he got asked, if it was a good idea for Israel to be murdering children. He said, I haven't heard the reports. They're very new, and I really would hesitate to comment right now because it's so new. It's like, dude, just say that it sucks to kill children while they're sleeping. Like, this is the extent to which we are dehumanized in the United States. So we're not waiting for the U.S. We're not waiting for the EU. We're certainly not going to wait for the corrupt Palestinian Authority, which has aided Israel in the colonization of its own people. We're not going to wait for anyone but ourselves. We're going to free ourselves, and we're going to free ourselves with the support of our allies. And that's the message that we are sending. And that's why Palestinian people are an example for all colonized people. For any person which is suffering under a violent colonial system of oppression, they can take an example from Palestinians, because right now they are doing absolutely everything to free themselves. And that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing the greatest Palestinian uprising in 73 years of Zionist colonialism. And it's happening, on the ground in Palestine, but also in exile.
You know what, Laura? I have to commend that. That was beautifully said. And I for one, look, this podcast, our listeners, we all stand with Palestine.
Thank you.
We walk with Palestine. We fight with Palestine because, again, if you guys aren't free, how can any of us be free? If the world can sit and watch this happen, who's to say that we're not next, right? Yeah. If we can watch this happen, that means that the Uyghur Muslims don't have a chance. You know what I'm saying? Like, all the people that are oppressed are looking at what's happening right now, and this is the flagship. This is the lighthouse that's signaling, okay, it's not dead in the water. We all have a chance if this has a chance.
Yeah. And again, if that's not enough for you, the Israeli soldiers are teaching the police officers how to kill black people, right? So all the tactics that they're getting to kill and, young children, they're doing the same thing for minorities here in America. So you can't say it doesn't hit home, because it is home for everybody.
Oh, you mentioned the rep not having a problem with killing the kids. I mean, this is a country that's still caging children. So
yeah. So why would they care about Palestinians being murdered or tortured in Israeli military prisons, right? They're still caging kids at their own border.
We can't be surprised.
Huh?
We can't be surprised.
No. And it's happening under a Democratic administration. They just changed the words. I think they they changed the name of the holding center or whatever.
Yeah, they did. Yeah. It's not concentration camps anymore.
You mentioned something earlier. It completely left me and it came back. How we were talking about, you were saying the right, we got the right and the left. You were mentioning the right, and there's a documentary that came out where it was talking about the, basically how Zionists took over, basically the term Jew.
Yeah.
White supremacy has taken over the right and turned it from something where it was like, if you're a Republican, like there was a certain prestige to it. You had morals and standards, to now them just being like Trumpettes. And it's the craziest thing I've seen. So, sorry, I just had to connect that dot.
Yeah. Shifting definitions. Absolutely. Shifting definitions of what things are. I mean, look, my Jewish friends will tell you the definition of anti-Semitism is when you hate Jews for being Jews. Like, Palestinians don't hate Jews for being Jews. We hate Zionists because they stole our land. And many Jews are not Zionists, and many people who support Zionists are not Jews. Like, it's so simple. And our reaction is not unjustified. Our reaction is the typical human reaction that anybody would exhibit in similar circumstances. It's as simple as that.
Well, Jabril, I think it's about that time.
Yeah.
Since Lara just dropped that mic, man, this is more information that we can take in. You're probably going to have to listen to this episode over and over and over and educate everybody around you. And yes, make sure you guys, as soon as you listen to this episode, follow Lara. We're going to plug her in, and make sure you find that BDS list. And Starbucks might be on it. So I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. That's just the type of moves that we're going to have to make.
I don't know that Starbucks is part of a targeted campaign, because these campaigns are very targeted, on specific companies where we know that we can make a difference, right? It's not just like boycott everyone, right? So that's why it's really critical to be guided by the local BDS, chapters in your community. And to
that's
find
what I say. You asking for a real uprising to boycott Starbucks. You want everybody to go in the uproar. You're crazy.
You can keep your Starbucks for now. I think. But just check your local BDS list.
Right, check out Netflix. But Jabril, I think it's about that time to wrap this thing up, man.
Absolutely, Lara. Thank you, everybody. Listen, share. Do the worst. So, Muhammad, if people want to find us, where can they find these podcasts, my friend?
Absolutely. So we are streaming on all the major platforms such as Spotify, SoundCloud, Google Play, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Pandora. We're going to free Palestine, every single platform out there. And Jabril, if they wanted to shoot us a direct message or watch this wonderful episode, how can they do that?
Absolutely. If you guys want to hit us up, if you guys want to learn more, if you guys want to find Lara, you guys can find us on Instagram, Young and Muslim. That's Young, the letter N, Muslim, Young and Muslim on Instagram. And give us both the follow on our personal pages if you like.
Yes.
And if you want to see these lovely faces, make sure you guys go and check us out on YouTube, the Young and Muslim podcast. Subscribe and hit the bell notification with the ding. And, that's where all the episodes will be going up.
And I think, Lara, if people want to follow you, find your podcast, how can they do that?
Yeah, so if they want to follow me on Instagram, I'm really super active. They can follow me at Gazan Girl, GAZANGIRL. If they want to follow me on Twitter, they can find me at The Gazan Girl. I had to put it because there was already an account with 10 followers, whatever. I'm still not happy about it.
She's a little hurt about that one.
I'm still trying to buy that account, but until I do, I'm at The Gazan Girl on Twitter. And if they want to listen to the podcast, we're also available wherever podcasts can be streamed, also on YouTube. And the podcast is called The Palestine Pod. They can also find us on Instagram and Twitter, where we post, short clips of our episodes.
Sweet. Well, thank you. We appreciate you for joining us and giving us all of this dope necessary information.
Thank you so much for the invitation, the platform, the space. It's a great honor to be here, and I really appreciate what you guys are doing, and really, really, really appreciate the support.
Absolutely. So. Don't leave yet. We got to wrap up. Didn't want you to leave before we finish up. So for the last, how long have you been on?
2:10.
For the last 2 hours, you have been listening to the Young and Muslim podcast. I'm Jabril Salam.
And Muhammad Hassan.
And this is
Lara Elborno.
And we leave it with the greens of peace.
Aslaamu
Alakum. Peace.